Okay, now I'm ready. Today I'm going to be talking about a new favorite book of mine, Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne. I'm going to start with the very beginning of this book, which is the cover, which I find to be absolutely brilliant. This may be one of my absolute favorite fantasy covers I have seen in a long time. It is both minimalist and extremely detailed at the same time. The artist for these covers actually does YouTube videos where he shows time lapses of creating these. I definitely recommend checking those out. I will link one down in the description. It's really awesome. This is a fantastic cover. If you somehow don't know what this book is about, I'll just give you a quick overview. This is a Norse mythology-esque fantasy story. It is really different from anything else that I've read in recent memory. It has a really fascinating magic system that kind of comes into play a little bit over time. The magic system isn't even really a focal point in this first book, although toward the end I'll say it becomes more prominent and more important, and I'm beginning to think that we're going to see the magic play a significant role here in the next couple of books. I would describe the magic system as pretty light just because we don't know all of the ground rules around it yet, and it may become a harder magic system here in the coming books. So if you're looking for something that won't bog you down with a bunch of details you don't really need at the moment, then this is a great book. I knew everything that I needed to know roughly when I knew it, including things that were just foreshadowing what was going to come later on in the book. I actually guessed a couple of the twists, and not because they were super predictable, but because John Gwynne did a fantastic job of laying the groundwork, helping us understand the magic system so that we could understand where some of these characters were going to go in the story. The world building in this was excellent, and this is a really, really accessible fantasy book. Honestly, now that I've read it, I would probably recommend it to people who have not yet read adult fantasy or who are just looking to get their feet wet with it. I would definitely suggest this as a fantastic starter book for that. Not because it's some super simple book that anybody in the world could understand, but because while it is a complex world, you're only given the information that you really need to know in the moment, and I really appreciated that. It made the book way easier to digest, and I finished it in about 2 or 3 days, which is really quick for me and my schedule. So that's an overview of what the book is, but let's talk about the contents of the book, and I want to start with the characters. The characters in this book were all excellent, and I'm not just talking about the 3 perspective characters that we get. Every character, including side characters and villains and possible villains, all of them were fantastically written. Their motivations were decipherable in many cases, or in some cases you could tell they had motivations even if you didn't quite know what they were yet. And the way that we were given insight into what they were thinking and feeling and into their past was all fantastically executed. The characters in the previous series by John Gwynne that I read, The Faithful and the Fallen, these 4, were all pretty fantastic. I enjoyed most of the characters in The Faithful and the Fallen, and I'll even say that the characters in that series were the best part of the story. So John Gwynne has always been pretty good at the character work, but I find it is strongest in Shadow of the Gods and may in fact be the strongest character work that I have read in quite some time. He did a wonderful job with the characters in this. But that's an overview of all of the characters. Let's hone in on our 3 perspective characters. We have 3 very distinct main characters here. We have a runaway slave named Varg who has done some questionable things in his past. He's done some really brutal and horrible things, and yet at the same time there are definitely justifications for why he did these things, and we learn more about that over time. He doesn't view himself as a horrible person, and I don't really view him as a horrible person. In fact, there are a couple of occasions where he may be referred to as a murderer, and he would correct the people who do that and say that he isn't a murderer. And that was a detail that I really liked. Our other 2 characters are really fascinating as well. One of them is a warrior in a warband that travels and captures slaves and hunts monsters and does all sorts of other sort of contractual work in order to earn their keep. The things that they do are questionable, and I'm definitely oversimplifying it just so that I can prevent there from being spoilers, but I will say that this character and the characters that are around her are morally questionable, sometimes at best, and I thought that made her storyline really fascinating because there were times when I knew what was happening with her storyline was wrong, and yet none of them come off as evil people, and you empathize and sympathize with these characters, which I really enjoyed. I think her perspective is really unique and adds additional insight into the moral ambiguity that is going to be present in this story, which I'm going to get into here in a minute because I want to talk about the last character, who is the coolest mother in fantasy that I have read about in a very long time. I'm sure that you can correct me. There are probably other really awesome mothers. She is this badass mother who is living on a farmstead with her son and her husband, and her son is super wholesome. I think that I related to her little child more than I related to any other character in the book, but she is more than just a really great mom. She has a violent streak. She knows her way around a weapon and does some really intense stuff with her weapons. There were some super cinematic scenes involving her that I greatly enjoyed. And between all of these 3, I cannot pick a favorite. Actually, during the filming of this, and I'm pretty sure I'm gonna cut all of it out, I've said after each of those 3 that all of them are my favorite characters. And with a cast like that, with those 3 really awesome characters who all have unique storylines and stories that I really want to see the rest of, it's hard for me to pick a favorite, and in fact, I can't pick a favorite. Okay, now let's talk about the stakes and the morality of the book, because this is something that I think has really improved between The Faithful and the Fallen and the Bloodsworn saga. I've mentioned on a number of occasions that the end of the entire world I feel is such a generic stake that I don't really care that much about it when it's in stories, and that was kind of the stake in The Faithful and the Fallen. It was pretty much the devastation of the entire world. And I also don't really like the Chosen One trope or anything like that, and neither of them are really present in this book. If you really stretch the definition of it, you could probably claim that the end of the world is at stake in this book, but it really doesn't feel like it, and I don't get the impression that's the purpose of the book. We also don't start the book off with the Chosen One, which I am very grateful for. Instead, we have three people who are all on their own interesting quests and have their own fascinating storylines to follow, and each and every one of them is equally important and equally enjoyable to read. So the stakes feel more individual and more approachable, and they also feel more relatable. Not necessarily because I can relate to everything that these characters are going through, but because it feels more realistic. Not that the end of the entire world does not feel realistic to me right now. But on top of that, we are also diverging from the typical good versus evil battle, which I am also extremely grateful for. I did not enjoy that in The Faithful and the Fallen. There may have been some morally gray characters, but it was usually extremely easy to tell who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. In this book, that's really not the case. Even our characters who are supposed to be the good guys, or at least I think they're supposed to be the good guys, do some things that are really questionable. And there's a scene very early on in one of the characters' stories where I knew what they were doing was wrong. And not only did they follow through with this wrongdoing anyway, they didn't really seem to care. And that was the moment when I realized this was going to be a story I really enjoyed, because now we had characters who were doing things for motivations other than just this is right or this is wrong. And in one case, we have a character who is so driven that he's willing to do whatever it takes in order to achieve his goal. And there are moments when you genuinely have no idea where the story is going to go because of that. It loses its predictability, and I really appreciate that. The story was only predictable to me when it felt like John Gwynne wanted it to be predictable to the reader. Other times, I really didn't know what was going to happen. It's hard to talk about without spoiling, but there are scenes toward the end of it when I felt the story could have gone in any direction. So Shadow of the Gods, the moral ambiguity, the stakes, everything is more grounded and believable, and that just makes the story all the more compelling. And I feel like I say this next part in every John Gwynne review, so I'm going to make sure that I'm as concise as possible. Once again, his writing is just improving significantly. Throughout The Faithful and the Fallen, I noticed several errors, even though they were starting to improve over time, and many of those could just be chalked up to a poor editor. But I also noticed all sorts of writing mistakes or outlining issues and things like that, just general story problems that needed to be corrected and that probably should have been fixed in the outlining phase. Here, there's really nothing I can complain about with his writing. The prose is fantastic and the outlining is excellent. He does a great job with foreshadowing. There's a lot of care to the storytelling here, and it's simply wonderful. The only thing that I will say is that he still repeats himself a lot. One negative thing I do have to say about his writing and about this book is that he still repeats himself a lot. He did it all through The Faithful and the Fallen, and he's doing it in The Shadow of the Gods as well. Specifically with his combat, I felt like it just wasn't as beautifully written as it was before. It was still great, don't get me wrong, there are some excellent combat scenes in here, but a lot of the time he was just repeating himself in each of the combat scenes, and it almost felt like we could probably gloss over this and just get to what happens next. Maybe make this one paragraph instead of 3 paragraphs where you're just saying the same thing that you've said 1,000 times in this book. I'm about to shatter some glass for you if you're somebody who has read or is going to read The Shadow of the Gods, but one of the things that he says a lot is axe and sax over and over again. Seriously, those 3 words, axe and sax. If I were somebody who drank and I played a drinking game based on that, I would be dead right now. But other than that, there was plenty of variety. The combat was great. The storytelling, fantastic. I don't have a lot of complaints in that regard. All right, and now let's talk about my overall rating for Shadow of the Gods, even though you've probably already guessed what that rating is going to be. But before I get to that, let me go ahead and remind you that you can like, comment, and subscribe all at no cost to you. It's totally free. You know what else is free? Me on Friday nights usually. All right, let's go ahead and get to my overall rating for Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne. 5 stars, easily. I don't know what else to say. It was a fantastic book, fantastically written. My complaints are so minor that they were barely worth mentioning. The characters are excellent, and I can't wait to see more of their story. Thank you so much for taking the time to check out this video. I really appreciate it. If you would like to see another video from me, you can do so by clicking up here. And until next time, bye.